Good afternoon, everyone. This is Viktor Eszterhai. I'm the research fellow at the John Lukács Institute, this university, and I have the pleasure and the privilege to have two distinguished speakers in this panel. So first of all, please let me introduce Dr. Sumantra Maitra, who's the director of the research of outreach at the American Ideas Institute. He's also senior fellow at the Center for Renewing America. Not to mention, he's also senior editor, the American Conservative. On my left, please let me welcome Dr. István Stumpf. He's a professor, former minister of the Prime Minister's office, technically the deputy prime minister, former member of the Constitutional Court, and currently the member of the Strategic Advisory Board of the Prime Minister. In February last year, Dr. Maitra wrote a paper entitled Pivoting the US Away from Europe to Dormant NATO. This received the controversial international attention, and that's the reason that we are here today also to discuss this paper in this circle. In your paper, you argued that the understanding of the security situation in the European arena by the NATO is not adequate, not meeting with the needs of our time. So therefore, the goals which are identified in the NATO and the implementation or the concrete policy is misguided. So today we are going to go around these topics. We're going to discuss these three major questions of your suggestion, the Dormant Europe strategy. And then in the circle, we also would like to ask the Hungarian opinion on about this concept. What could be Hungary's role if this could be implemented in the near future? So first of all, my question would turn to you. You argued that when the NATO was created during the Cold War, the strategic landscape and security landscape of Europe was completely different to our days. Would you identify the major differences, just to understand how do you see this issue?
Thank you for having me today, and I hope that I'm clear enough when it comes to my voice. So when NATO was formed in the 1940s, late 1940s, early 50s, the security situation was obviously a bipolar world. There was this hulking giant on the east, which had one of the largest production capacity and power. USSR was producing industry and weapons at a rate that Russia isn't now. That's number one. Number two, NATO, the development of NATO from a defensive alliance in the 50s and 60s and 70s to a post-defensive alliance in the 90s, especially after Kosovo, and then after the second phase of expansion with Latvia and the Baltics in the 2004, that changed the strategic dynamic of the continent in a way where it moved the threat potential from the western parts of Europe towards the east. So you would probably remember, all of you, but for those who don't know, one of the first guys who wanted NATO expansion in the early 90s wasn't an American, it was a German. His name was Volker Ruh. Herr Ruh, he wanted NATO expansion because originally it was part of the German unification plan, that East Germany and West Germany would be united, and James Baker from the US, Margaret Thatcher from UK, and we told Gorbachev that we are not going to expand. Eastern Germany and Western Germany are going to have a united, country, and that is it. Then USSR collapsed. That promise that we made, it wasn't written. There was no written promise, obviously, so no one can say that it was a treaty that we broke, but it was a promise. That promise didn't materialize because the promise was made to the USSR, and USSR as an entity wasn't there anymore. And after that, the second phase of expansion, up until the second phase, Russians were fine. Russians were fine with Hungarians and Czechoslovakians at that point of time together, and Poles getting part of the NATO alliance. It was after that the Russians started to change. You would remember Primakov turning his plane and going back. And then 9/11 happened, and Putin thought that he's going to be an ally of the United States, and he was the first country to reach out, form an alliance against Islamic extremism. And we wanted bases in Central Asia, and we were like very happy with Russians. And then that changed because George W. Bush said that we are going to move out or move out the security of the missile defense things in Europe. And the Russian phases of reaction to various stages of NATO expansion started to change. 3 phases of NATO expansion had three different reactions from the Russians. But Ukraine and Georgia was obviously a red line. Now, my paper starts with 3 assumptions. On one hand, the security situation of Europe has changed to the point where it's not like 1949. The Russians are a problem in the East, but they are not a hegemonic threat like the Soviet Union under Stalin was. They don't have the production capacity or the manpower, or fundamentally, we don't live in a bipolar world. So that's assumption number 1. Assumption number 2, the actual great power which is happening in the East. The Chinese, I was just giving an interview, I'm going to say it's the exact same things for those of us, you were there to hear me, you probably like feel me repeating my stuff, but fundamentally, the Chinese production capacity and manpower is miles ahead of what any other great power rival to America was. The Spanish Empire, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, Imperial Japan, none of those powers are in any way capable, or were in any way capable per GDP or production capacity as China is. So that is something which is happening. It's a structural dynamic. It is happening tomorrow. If there is a war in Asia, Americans are going to move. It is not a matter of question of if, it is a matter of when. It will happen. Assumption number 3, there are no single coherent European interest. There is no one in the European continent to take over the role that America does, purely because of the number of, the security guarantee that America can provide. It's an advantage, it's also a disadvantage. We cannot pass, the burden to someone, so one single country. That is not going to happen because there is no one to take. I mean, who's going to be in the American position with the American nuclear and naval guarantee? France, Britain? Not going to happen. So my paper was a moderate position, a compromise. The compromise is in the way that on one hand, Americans keep the nuclear power, they keep the naval power, they provide the ultimate security guarantee. But on the other hand, there needs to be some sort of burden shifting because tomorrow, things might change. The burden shifting would be in very simple things that Europe can do on its own. Logistics, armor, infantry, intelligence. These are the things that Europeans are completely capable of doing. They understand the land, they understand the region, they have the money. The only reason why the Europeans, especially Western Europeans, not Hungary, but especially like Germany or Luxembourg, is because 1, they don't feel the threat, and 2, they don't have to pay because Uncle Sucker is there. That is going to change. And the way to change that is instead of talking about burden sharing, we will talk about burden shifting. Burden sharing has failed. It is a strategy and rhetoric that has failed for the last 40 years. It is not going to work. What will work is we are going to shift portion of the burden to the Europeans and keep the main things to us. At the end of the day, America will not leave the European continent if Dormant NATO happens. If it doesn't happen, then tomorrow, if you guys are not prepared, and if there is a war in Asia, that's not a situation that no one in a normal mind wants to contemplate. So that is the assumption of the paper.
Thank you very much. I would like to turn to Professor Stumpf. First question is that do you agree with the understanding of the strategic and security landscape in Europe and this kind of description of the international system? And is there any specific Hungarian take on this?
Thank you very much. Let me start some personal experience. When I was the minister of the Prime Minister's office, we became the member of the NATO. So I am participating in that kind of ceremony, which we were very happy. It was an enthusiasm. We are under that kind of big umbrella, so that the NATO is going to defend us and the Central European neighboring as well. And later on, I visited to China to prepare the Prime Minister Orbán Viktor visit to China. But during that time, the NATO bombed the Belgrade. And I just negotiated with the Prime Minister of China, but he did not finish that kind of conversation, but it was a very interesting approach that. And also we became the member of the war against the Balkan. The neighboring country was very much, we are afraid that those people who are living around the border could cause lots of problems. So the first experience was not very enthusiastic than the first moment. And later on, there was the very interesting conflict between the US and Hungary, because the Prime Minister decided that we are going to buy not F-16, but the Scandinavian Gripen. So it was a very surprise decision there. But I think because in my room, the big leader of the military resources, Jay, just showed a very good picture about the F-16, that it's very good fighters and so on. But finally, not happened that. And that was one of the reasons why the Hungarian relationship with the US on this side, the military side, was not very friendly. And also there was another issue as well, but that was the message that Hungary would like to keep some kind of independent decision-making process, being the member of the NATO, but not being just following that kind of behavior. So just we would like to develop our strategy. That's happening right now. And your paper is very important because it's sending the message that we have to use this kind of approach as a sovereignistic approach. And the NATO should be the original responsibility as a defense alliance. And this could be the secure the base, and this area is herited different kind of conflict. And if we are not focusing on the original function of the NATO, but we would like to use the NATO some political and ideological type of strategy, I think it's not very good. And also very important, the geography point of view. You very much stress that the geography-oriented strategy should replace the ideology-oriented policy, because if we are not calculating our borders, not defending our borders during the migration age, I think it could cause the problem, much more higher problem than the border in Mexico and in the United States. So I think that message is important, but it requires some kind of conservative leadership in the US. And as far as I following the actual development around the electoral politics in the US, there is the chance that Trump is going to be the president the next year. And also the Heritage Foundation, the 2025 project very much describe that kind of guidelines for the new president. And also there is some very hard and very serious sentence that the first enemy of the United States is China. In those countries who is going to develop some kind of relationship with China, it could cause the problem the US and the other relationships. So I think this is a very good paper to think about the future of not just the NATO, but also the European Union.
Can I have like one second? First of all, thank you. I was very tense that you're going to fail me, but I'm glad that you agree. I want to add two things to the professor's points that he mentioned, and he's right. The original character of NATO was not an ideological alliance. This is something that is forgotten in Europe. NATO originally was a defensive alliance. As long as it was a defensive alliance, it was fine. The reason Kosovo changed everything was because that was the first time in NATO's history that, one, it changed from a defensive alliance to an aggressive alliance. It went and bombed. Second, it did that in a country in the name of internal affairs. So the fundamental sovereign idea that a country can take care of its own situation, regardless of how brutal it is, it can't do that. That changed. Take a guess as to what the Russians said in 2008 when they went to Georgia. They said that you guys did that in Kosovo, we are going to do that in Georgia. So fundamentally, the same idea that NATO changed from a defensive alliance to an ideological alliance is one of the most important points. The NATO bureaucracy has increased from at a maximum of 200 people to 1,500 people. What are they tweeting about? Human rights. Why are they tweeting about human rights? That's not their job. They're a North Atlantic Defensive Alliance. Unless you're facing a great power war, why are you even tweeting about things? That's not your job to do. Someone is paying for it. Who's paying for it? Us. This is not sustainable. This is not going to happen. The people in America, go to Michigan, say that whether they want to die for Mariupol, ask what they want, see how they react. Why do you think Trump is, changing this political side? Why do you think there are hundreds of Republican congressmen who are currently voting against aid in Ukraine? Because the structural reason, the economy of the country has changed. We are not in a position, this is not unipolarity, this is not 1992. We cannot just say what we want to do. It is not going to happen. And because it is not unipolarity, there is a massive great power on the East. It is going to change. That gaze is going to shift. That is going to happen anyway. So I'm glad that you mentioned the ideological point. I wish you talked more about that, because that is one of the most interesting points. NATO's character has changed in the last 20 years.
But you are agree that that kind of observation that the NATO or the US changing their mind, they would like to develop some kind of very strong country nearby Ukraine, like Poland, and not Germany, because with Germany there is the traditional conflict, because the US afraid that after the Pax Americana we are going to build a new globalized world where not America will be the dominant probably you read Alison Graham books about the Thucydides things, but I think we are in the middle of this kind of process, and the America should think very carefully, and they would like to replace Germany with Poland, who could be the crucial partners for the US and also the crucial alliance of the NATO.
I want to add something to this, because during the Trump administration, when there was a switch in focus to Poland and the Central Eastern European region from the Western countries, they could see, okay, this situation can be pleasant for us at the same time. But now when we are talking more about ideology, and during this administration there is more focus on ideology and values, all Europe has to act together. So when you're seeing that, when you're arguing that EU has to find its own way to provide this defense for itself, is it really smart to give up the values? And
so, number one, in my paper, if you read, I specifically mentioned that European Union itself cannot be an actor. There is no one single European interest. When we are talking about Germany, right, if you were advising the German government, what would you say? Your frontiers have moved to the east. Russians are bogged down in Ukraine. They're dying. Ukrainians are dying. Poland is a massive hulking power, having a lot of power right between you and Russia. The American troops are there in the Baltics. The British Navy is there in the Mediterranean. Why on earth would you pay money for your defense? The German interest, people say that Germans have gone weak. No, they have gone smart. They control the European Union's economy. They don't need to spend in military. They don't need to spend because they don't get to see the threat. The moment they don't get to see the threat, they are spending on their own security. They're spending on their own country. That's fine by them. The fundamental problem is not European Union. I think it is a mistake for Europeans to think that if America shifts, there will be one actor which would replace that. It's not going to happen. There is no one single actor that can just take America's place. It's not going to be France. It's not going to be UK. Absolutely not going to be UK. Definitely not going to be Germany. Right? Poland is a strong power. And I don't think the Russians are capable, at least at this point, to invade, to go through the Baltics, rush through Poland, go through Germany and Belgium, and go reach the English Channel. I mean, come on, like it's not rational to think like that. But what could happen is there are countries in the Eastern Europe which are genuinely threatened by Russia. It's understandable. There needs to be minilaterals. There needs to be, you know, you mentioned Gripen. What are the Swedes good at? They're good at creating fighter jets. They're good at intelligence. Finland, great at intelligence. They can defend the Arctic, have like a local alignment with local force, positioning. One of my things that I mentioned in my paper is to have European command and coordination. European command and coordination doesn't mean that it would be under the European Union. Because the moment you have the European Union, there will be the same, you are going to face the same problem that Americans face. The Western Europeans would be like, you guys defend yourself, you're in the middle of us and Russian, why are we going to pay? Not going to happen. So you have to divide that in regional blocks. There would be an American nuclear umbrella, but in the north, the Italians, what are the Italians good at? Anti-aircraft guns. Why do they need American anti-aircraft guns in the Mediterranean? They're not going to use that. The Russians are not going to come through Mediterraneans. You're facing a problem of migration. Focus on local policing. You know, spend money on that. Why do you need to have like American anti-aircraft guns in the Mediterranean? You don't need that. There are 5 American Air Force bases. We need maximum 2. In Ramstein in Germany and in Turkey, where we have the nuclear weapons. We don't need a base in Portugal. We don't need a base in Italy. What is the requirement of an American base, an American Air Force base in Italy? What can we not reach in the entire North Africa, in the entire Middle East, in the entire Mediterranean that we need a base in Italy? We can do that from Turkey, we can do that from Germany. Cut down the base. These are simple, small changes. You don't need massive global shifts. You can do very small changes. Interoperability. There are 7 different types of main battle tanks used in Europe by different countries. Why do you need 7 different types of battle tanks? Have a joint coordination committee formed under the different countries. Have like Germans and French and the British come together and decide on what kind of single battle tank and single 155 ammunition shells you're going to produce. Very simple thing to do. Interoperability is something that you can focus on tomorrow. You don't need the Americans to do that. The Americans have one single battle tank. They are the ones who are producing weapons. Why can't you guys do that? It's a very simple. I'm not saying that it's. Look, this is not a criticism. I have to mention that I'm not criticizing what is happening. I'm just saying there is too much complacency in the way, and tomorrow, if situations change, it might change over the time, it might change precipitously if there is a war in Taiwan, but it will change. And when that changes, you guys need to be prepared for that. That is my only concern.
Okay, I agree with you, but we are in the wartime right now. And the General Secretary of the NATO is sending the message for the member states, and also those are the Ukrainians and the Russians, that the NATO is moving to be a part of this conflict. Why he is going to do that? Or this is just, as you mentioned, ideological type of activities of the NATO, and not very much thinking about the borders and the interest of the different countries. So why is it going on? And why the General Secretary, this is just a part of the campaign, who will be the next General Secretary of the NATO, or that it doesn't matter anything, because the General Secretary of the NATO is not a serious people. The most important thing is what the US is thinking about that.
So, I'm going to say something that might sound banal. The NATO section says stuff because he has to say things. It doesn't mean much. One of the top lessons of foreign policy is do not listen to what people are saying. Look at what they're doing. One of the things that Americans did is, with all the talks of we are going to stand behind Ukraine, well, yeah, 3,000 miles behind Ukraine. You know, they said all those things, and then they were like, yeah, we are going to support Mark Rutte and not Kaja Kallas. Why? Ask yourself the question. Because Americans understand that we don't want someone who would be interested in going to war with Russia. It's easy to talk. What they're doing is a different thing. Jens Stoltenberg came to Heritage Foundation, right? Heritage Foundation had an interview and question with him, and they started by saying, why do you think that the deterrence in Europe and NATO has failed? And Stoltenberg said, hang on a minute. First of all, deterrence in Europe and NATO has not failed. You know, NATO, there is no country attacking NATO. NATO is not at war. It doesn't matter what we are saying. There's far more of a danger of a miscalculation of a Ukrainian missile hitting Poland, by the way, that happened. And, you know, pivoting to a war than actually having this is not 1962. There is no Third Shock Army standing in the Fulda Gap. You know, it's not that situation. The problem is not what they are saying. The problem is what might happen if there is a miscalculation. You know, wars happen when there are things in close proximity. Everyone has seen, what's the name of that movie? Hunt for Red October. I was mentioning to Carlos, who's sitting there, by the way. You should listen to him. He's a great guy. I was mentioning Hunt for Red October, and there is this scene where the American deputy secretary is talking to the Russian ambassador and say, like, do you want our ships and your ships in close proximity? Do you want our weapons and your weapons in close proximity? No. Wars happen that way. Why? Because of miscalculations. So what NATO is saying, that we are going to stand with Ukraine, that is talk. Talk is different. Talk is very cheap. Actions are different than talks. You probably obviously know this more than me. Like, I don't want to, yeah, you've been in that position anyway, so.
That's right. There is a big difference between talking and also what are you doing, but
just one thing which I want to mention before you said, if we wanted to go to war, if NATO wanted to go to war, they would have been in war. There was a no-fly zone effort in the early days when people were like, yeah, we should have a no-fly zone in Russia. Every American, there were like a polling done in America. 72% of the people, yeah, we are going to have no-fly zone. And then someone wrote a letter saying, do you know what a no-fly zone means? It means you are going to not just shoot Russian planes, but you would have to shoot their SAMs, which is based in Crimea. And then that polling went down to 32%. People understand that they don't want to go to war. There is a Ukrainian Foreign Legion. How many people are joining that? Check how many people are tweeting they support Ukraine. Why aren't they joining the Ukrainian Foreign Legion? No one wants to go to war. Understand that. No one wants to go to war. Talk is cheap. It's easy to tweet. That's not going to war.
Somebody said that the 21st century talking about the space competition.
That's right.
And the NATO is in the space, or there is just a big player, US, Russia, and China, challenging each other? Or is there a strategy that we have to, I mean, the NATO should participate in this kind of competition, but it is a competition not between the different. This is the defense alliance. If defense alliance, you have to go up,
right?
And you have to
grow or die. Yeah. No, I think that is exactly right. I mean, look, in sociology, if you read about bureaucracy, bureaucracy has got a character of its own. They either expand and find missions for themselves, or they die. It's what bureaucracies are. It's the bureaucracy. Look at NHS in the UK. Look at the national security bureaucracy in Pentagon in the US. NATO is a bureaucracy. It has to grow or it has to die.
Bureaucracy or a deep state?
Yeah, well, I mean, anyway. But fundamentally, the idea, the reason NATO acts in the way it acts is because it's on autopilot. We have lived under unipolarity for 30 years. 30 years, 2 generations of people who have grown, went to universities, read the same research papers, understood that there's an end of history, went to work in Pentagon and in NATO. It's muscle memory. It will take time to change. You know, we didn't go to war in Syria when the Russians went to support Bashar Assad. We could have, we didn't, because there is a limit to muscle memory. At one point in time, you have to go and sit in the table and say like, okay, we are going to do this, and that might happen to us. That is when things change. Same thing happened in Ukraine. We are supplying weapons, that's a different thing. We are bleeding Russians in Ukraine, great. But going to war, having the Russian missiles coming to DC, that's a different concept. You know, someone has to think about that. Muscle memory changes with time. NATO will absolutely have to change at some point of time. How long it's going to take, that's a different question. But it would, because the structural dynamic of the world changes.
It's not really my position to put on the table the Hungarian government's position in this concept, regarding this concept. Partially, it welcomes very much our ears that provides more space to Europeans to do their own business. But at the same time, Europe is really not in this issue now. It's a major focus is kind of creating a unified position on everything. So you just don't care the European dream to create a kind of European United Union, or just so, or you see the EU as a challenge for the American position, and because that's very crucial in Europe to discuss this, because we are happy with your concept.
Right.
Just the EU is not really is in this mode.
With my accent, I don't think I should talk about how.
This will be very interesting for the younger generation, because for the perception of the EU is very much different than our cynical positions who are doing this business for a while.
I don't think it's sustainable the way it is currently. There are three ways, and again, I don't speak for any government. I don't speak for the British government. I don't speak for the American government. I speak for myself. European Union potentially, if it keeps consolidating, will have to face two major issues. One, at some point of time, it would be in a position where it is a consolidated trade power. The moment it's a consolidated trade power, it would have some kind of problem with the Americans. You have to understand the scale and the size of America. America is almost a continent in itself. There are 340 million people. It's almost the same as the entirety of Europe. If tomorrow the Americans see that they are providing security to Europe and Europeans are finding American companies, good luck. Number two, European Union has a problem with one single common law principle, nemo judex in causa sua. You cannot have your own cases against you in your own courts. You cannot do that. The moment European Union tries to consolidate, that is something which is going to come into forefront. If tomorrow there is a law in Germany and that law is in conflict with Poland or Hungary, that case goes to the European courts. The European courts, any case against the European courts, they are not going to rule in favor of a country. They're going to rule in favor of the European Union. Now that might be, some people might want that, and that's fine, but that is something for the Europeans to decide. That's not for me to say. At one point of time, you have to sit and decide, do I believe in the idea of sovereignty and democratic principles, or do I want to be a part of an empire? People can say that they want to be a part of an empire, and that's great. You can be a part of the empire and grow up to be a bureaucrat in the imperial bureaucracy. The Habsburgs were like that. You were part of that movement, that empire. So I'm not here to like lecture as to the history of that period, but it could happen. Now, whether you want that or not is something that Europeans need to decide. Number three, and this is important, European Union is an artificial construct. You have to remember the history of the European Union. It was originally supported by the Americans because it was a good thing to do during the Cold War and after the Cold War. The character of that changed after the Cold War. And at one point of time, the Americans didn't really think about it, but at one point of time they realized that it is too much of a burden. Europe, throughout its history, has never been united without force. Whether it's Roman Empire or Charlemagne or Kaiser or Napoleon, or even after the Second World War when the Russians and the Americans conquered Europe. And then the Russians moved back, and the Americans essentially supported the European Union. That dynamic is ever present. It's not something that anyone would advocate, but it is just a law of nature. If you need to keep something strong and united, at some point of time there needs to be an action of force. Now, at one point of time, if Americans move away or there is a trade gap between America and European Union, who do you think will be in a position to apply that force to keep the country, to keep the entity consolidated? I don't have the answer to that question because I don't know. We haven't seen that situation. We haven't faced that situation so far. It might happen in the future, it might not, but no one knows. But if it does, think of a hypothetical situation where tomorrow the European Union is a trade rival of America. It has one single army, under one single flag, one single religion, liberal internationalism. Do you think the Americans are just going to be like, yeah, that's fine? Do you think the Russians are going to be like, yeah, it's great? Even the British. Do you think the British, like for 500 years, they had the one single strategy to have disunited Europe? Do you think they're going to be fine with it? Ask yourself these questions. I don't know the answer to these questions, but these are the three important questions that you need to figure out. Force, law, and economy. These are the three things that the European Union has no answer so far. Someone might do a research. Someone might write that this is the way to move forward with that. This is the kind of balance. You guys might be doing researches on that one in the future. Great. Figure out a way. But those are the three questions that has not been answered. And unless those three questions can be answered, there is no one can predict the future in that situation.
Thank you. This is very clear. How's it lined with the Hungarian perception of the future of Europe?
Yeah, you are right that these three things is important. But when you are talking about the law, I mean the justice of the Constitutional Court, I am saying that I am the sovereignist. So I would like to defend our culture, our history, and our constitution. And if somebody from the European Union is violating our constitution and our very internal face of the constitution, this is not allowed. That's the reason why the constitutional courts of the member state playing a very important role, because they are able to say that that kind of norm which was passed by the European Union is not applicable in that country. And this is just only one organ able to say that, because when you are talking about the force and the economy, the government, the small governments, they are not in the position to say no, because if they are going to change the rules, which under preparation, the veto capacity is going to struck down, and also we have to save the original idea of the European Union, the cooperation of independent and sovereign nation.
I agree with you.
And that is the reason why Hungary would like to follow that kind of law, that kind of norm, which we started several years ago. And I think the Prime Minister very much representing that things. And I can imagine that he is a trouble guy for those people who would like to unite the European Union. And I do not know the so-called the federal European Union, how could exist, because without real power, without real military source, and without real economical cooperation. So that's the reason why it's the big challenge for the European Union. And there is another problem. The Chinese president just visited Hungary. And I realized that the Heritage Project and also the Conservative Project as well would like to describe China as the first enemy of the United States. And I am just wondering that how could we handle this very interesting position that we are in the small nation and we have to build a connectivity and cooperation in different kind of big powers. And if the United States just saying that I am not willing to cooperate those countries who are cooperating with the Chinese, I think this is also the big trouble for these countries.
Yeah. Before giving the floor to the audience, that would be my question as well. So you mentioned that we have to have some basic common interest. This is the Atlantic security, and beside it is necessity to have the same interest on China, or to accommodate this interest on China, or it's okay for the United States, according to your concept, that we don't care what you do with China, but we have a common interest on Atlantic security, and it's enough.
So I have to be very careful about how I phrase this. The Chinese are communists.
It's ideology.
Yeah.
Values. No.
Look, it's one thing to be a realist and have a balancing act throughout history. You know, there are countries which did that. Austria did that. Switzerland's doing it. Your own history of this country is very different. I was talking to someone today. One of the largest cannon makers of the world was a guy who was a Hungarian in 1453. He wanted to sell the cannon to the Byzantines, The Byzantines didn't want to buy the cannon, so he sold them to the Ottomans. So realism is in the blood of this country, which is good. Great, well done. There is a difference between realism and taking risks. Understand that at some point of time, there is a point where one needs to choose a side. It's a good thing to be smart and clever about it. It's not a good thing to be too clever by half. And one of the things in diplomacy and foreign policy is the idea that power is usually sub rosa. It's underground. If you're too much in the light, there will be too many things that people will talk about. So diplomacy is smart, realism is smart, balancing position is a very smart thing to do. It's a very clever thing to do when you're in the middle and trying to, be in a position of power, and it's a clever thing to do. Like I personally appreciate that. Be very cognizant, if not careful, about how you're playing whom. And at some point of time, you shouldn't be in a position where you don't have any friend. That is all I can say in a very diplomatic way.
Thank you, we get the message. I would like to give the floor to the audience. Is any of you have a question? If not, I would like to turn to Professor Stumpf. Do you want to react on this last message? Because
I just would like to ask you that the NATO could play an important role to avoid the atomic war.
Where?
Here in Europe.
Oh, in Europe. I mean, I don't foresee where the atomic war is going to be.
I hope so, but every day in my child's and my friends asking me that if we are escalating that kind of conflict in Ukrainian and the Russian and the NATO is going to participate in this project, it's not impossible that there will be some kind of mistake. It's enough.
I agree. No, I totally agree.
You are not able to stop that.
Yeah. War has a momentum of its own. Once it starts rolling, you cannot stop, the spiral. So absolutely, I agree. I mean, one of my concerns is like one single European country independently sending troops to Ukraine, saying like, yeah, we're going to do that. Even if Ukraine is a part of the European Union, first of all, it's going to cost a lot of money to have a country which is completely broken inside the European Union. Are the Germans and the Dutch going to pay for it? Maybe, I don't know. But the second thing is, European Union also has got a joint defense treaty. So if a European country and the European Union is in war with Russia, if they are the ones who are starting the war, then Article 5 of NATO doesn't apply. You cannot be an aggressor and then claim defense. You only will be defended if you are under attack. But if France or if Poland wants to go to war with Russia, they are free to do that. But the moment the Russians hit back, the moment Charles de Gaulle is sunk in the Mediterranean Sea with 6,000 people dead, Americans are not going to come to defend. So that is something one needs to be careful. I don't foresee that happening. There is a 0.001% chance of anyone actually looking to go to war with Russia. And the same thing goes with Russia. The Russians don't want, at least so far, to go to a nuclear war either. They don't want to be torched. It's the same thing if there is a nuclear war, they're not going to survive. The entire, sky of the Western Hemisphere will be unbreathable. If you think like you can be in a country without taking part in the war, but there is a nuclear war going on around you, good luck breathing, because that's not going to happen. So I think the fundamental, great power war, to avoid a great power war, European civilization twice in human history faced great power wars. I don't think that's a thing that anyone should want. I think it's a smart thing to avoid that, and I think it's a smart thing to deter your friends. One of the things that is noticeable, for example, is Hungarians and the Poles are allies when it comes to social conservatism. On foreign policy, who are your allies? Austria and Scholz of Germany. Foreign policy is a smart thing. You have alignments and friends with people who are otherwise your enemies. That's why it's foreign policy. Richelieu had an alignment with the Protestants against the Habsburgs. Foreign policy doesn't have friends. It has allies. Right? There are no friends in this place. So if you can figure out a way to do that, that's great.
Thank you. Last chance for a question. There's no question. I will have a very short.
I usually have make people speechless.
I will have a very short. What you put on the table for us is not necessarily very attractive to most of the European countries. I'm not talking about necessarily Hungary. So, but just the most, I would say, majority of the European countries would not welcome this kind of scenario. How do you see this? You do this just by force, with sticks, or you want to juice it with some carrots?
No, because I think it's just going to happen the moment Americans say, like, good luck, figure it out. It's I mean, what are the other options? Like, you know, break up and alignment, or ask Russians and Chinese to...
We have to fasten our seatbelts.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's not an abandonment of Europe. Please don't get me wrong. There is no advocacy of anyone saying, like, I mean, there are people in America, by the way. If Dormant NATO is one of the moderate positions, please don't think that I am the extremist here. Like, if Dormant NATO doesn't happen, there are people in America who wants to pull out everything out of Europe. That is not something that, there will be an American nuclear umbrella, there will be an American Navy, there will be the 2nd Fleet and the 6th Fleet. So all of those things are there. But if the simple things like armor and infantry, I mean, that is what diplomats should do. You should have back channels with the Germans. You know, they don't want to say it in public, but they would absolutely talk to you guys in private. Talk to the Germans about, like, listen, the Ukraine war has gone too far. You don't want France to go to war with Russia. You don't want NATO to go to war with Russia. Let's figure out a way to do that. That's clever diplomacy. That's something which you guys need to do.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much for being here with us today. And I also would like to thank the audience for your attention. And thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.